As I say, we're extremely pleased to have Father Robert Drinan with us today. Father Drinan has a very long history in politics and academics, a very distinguished history. He was congressman from Massachusetts from 1970 to 1980. He was dean of the law school at Boston College. He more recently is a professor of law at Georgetown University. He recently published a book called The Mobilization of Shame on International Human Rights Issues. It's an excellent book. I've read it, and I recommend it highly. He has another book that will be coming out this summer from Yale University Press on religious freedom and world law. Father Drinan has also served as the chair of the section on professionalism for the American Bar Association. He teaches classes at Georgetown Law on ethics and constitutional law. He's been involved in a large number of other organizations, too many to mention. So we're very pleased to have him here today to talk about the United States' ambivalence towards international human rights. And so let's give a round, a warm welcome to Father Drinan.
Thank you very much, Professor. I have warm memories of Utah. 6 summers ago, I spent 6 weeks teaching at the University of Utah. I had wonderful associations there. And one of my glories, one of the honors of my life, is that I have been a longtime friend of Dallin Oaks. He and I put out a book years ago when he was an assistant professor at the University of Chicago Law School. It was all about church and state, and we solved the problem. You haven't heard about it since. I commend you also for having that lovely prayer before the meetings. In the old days, every Jesuit college and school would have a prayer at the beginning of class, and the prayer suggested that we are honored to be in the presence of each other because Christ is here. And when I think of human rights, I always think of what Christ said, and we can never forget it. Christ said, as you know, whatsoever you do to the least of my brethren, you do unto me. And we should be very aware that when we talk or deal with any human being, we are dealing with Christ himself. And that's a very transforming thing in your life. And I've known a doctor in Boston who every day he says that when I meet a patient, it's as if I'm meeting Christ himself. Well, I commend you at this splendid university and all that you continue to do for the future of humanity. When I talk to people your age, I always wonder, it's kind of an obsession, what would your world be 20 years from now, and what kind of a world have we left to you? Will there be misery and terrorism and fear and prejudice, or will we somehow have a whole new world? Theoretically, you should move into a new world where everything is better than the world that I have lived in. And that was the dream in World War II. Mr. Roosevelt had the prescience and the knowledge and the vision to say, we are going to transform the human race. And he did with the formation of the United Nations. That now has all 191 nations of the earth as members. And that the UN says in 5 different places in the Charter that human rights, the observation and protection of human rights, is the #1 objective of this instrument of international law. That's a fantastic development because in the League of Nations, human rights was not mentioned even once. The founders of the UN wanted to have right in the Charter the Bill of Rights. That was not possible. Consequently, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated by 48 nations in Paris on December 10, 1948. Mrs. Roosevelt was one of the framers of that. And since that time, we have had all around the world a revolution in human rights, so that now is the coin of the realm, if you will, and that we look back and we say that the world was transformed completely in 1945. And that, unfortunately, as I'm going to say in a little while, and I want your comments, I won't talk for that long, and that we in the United States have not lived up to the vision and the dream of the United Nations. The UN started off nobly, And in fairness to everybody involved, it was changed because of the Cold War. And when Eastern Europe fell in 1949 and Beijing the same year to the communists, obviously the West and the United States became different, very different, that we are fighting the communists. We may have exaggerated it, but all of that is gone now. But shortly after the establishment of the UN, we had covenants, and there's 21 covenants now on human rights, not all of which are ratified by the United States. We'll come to that. The superpowers differed as to the political and economic rights, and unfortunately they fell apart, and that they are still apart, and they kicked in not until 1976. There were non-governmental groups formed around this time, and I was happy to chat just now with the leaders of Amnesty International on this beautiful campus. That was established in 1961 by a Catholic lawyer in London who saw that children or students were being abused in Zares, Portugal at that time. And he formed an organization, the core of which is to protest the denial of human rights. And that organization now, after all these years later, is the number one. It's the premier, primeval organization devoted to human rights. They generate millions of letters every year. I'm happy to see your chapter here so active. And if you get tired of writing letters, remember that Amnesty International says we can say that 60% of those people whom we adopt as prisoners of conscience, they get out of jail. It is an amazing organization, and there's now several hundred non-governmental groups that follow Amnesty International. Well, one of the things that happened along the way is that the Cold War collapsed. You hardly remember the Cold War, and it was a torture of my life through the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s, and finally in 1990 the Berlin Wall fell, and that the whole thing is over. President Clinton had the vision in 1993 to say, we have to come together, all of the nations of the earth, and reconcretize, reconceptualize international human rights. And that was done in 1993 in Vienna with 172 nations. And I was there as the delegate for the American Bar Association, and you can't imagine the excitement. The 40 years of the Cold War is gone. We can go back and now focus on the original objective of the United Nations, namely the implementation of internationally recognized human rights. And that was one of the most exciting days or weeks of my life. And the whole world was transformed. And in the book to which the professor referred, I have the full text of Vienna, the reaffirmation of the Universal Declaration, and there is the #1 document to which 172 nations have pledged their commitment. So this is a new universe. And don't say we have to go back over the tired dog fights of the United Nations. That's not true. We have a new mandate. This is Magna Carta. This is the new charter of the United Nations, and we should be living by that. We also have many spin-offs of the United Nations. That very year, the World Health Organization was established in 1945. That has changed the world completely. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome, has quite literally transformed the world. It has quadrupled the agricultural output of the world since that time. We also have other organizations like UNESCO and UNICEF. I hope you get to know and admire the works of the United Nations. It's sometimes common now to suggest, oh, it's just a debating society. I can assure you the work of that fantastic organization goes on, and that the United States should participate in it more. Why are we so reluctant, or at least officially? Why is it that we are not enthusiastic about the UN? That was the question that confronted us in the Congress in 1974. We had just learned that the United States had destabilized a popularly elected government in Chile, and we didn't know about it even in the Congress. And as a result, the Congress took the foreign policy into our own hands, and we said in our bill that it is the duty of the United States in its foreign policy to go forward with the objectives of the United Nations. And we wrote in Section 502B that the United States may not give any aid civil or military, to any nation that denies internationally recognized human rights. We insisted also that the State Department have a new Bureau on Human Rights and that they publish every year a monumental document on the state of human rights around the world. You look for that document. It comes out every Friday, every February, and it's now 3,000 pages all online. And you will see that we track the state of human rights in Chile and all the nations of the earth, and that includes the rights of labor unions, the rights of children, the rights of women, and the rights of refugees. Well, where are we today? All these years later, we look back at the Carter administration, and it was truly fantastic on human rights. Jimmy Carter said more than once, human rights is the soul of our foreign policy. The Reagan administration was less enthusiastic. They only emphasized the terror of the communists. That the Clinton administration was really quite good. He's the one that I mentioned called the meeting in Vienna, and that he did all that he could to bring us up to date. Well, what is happening around the world? You should know about the European Commission and Court on Human Rights. It has some 53 nations. They all litigate there, and that court has elevated the standards of human rights. You should also know about the Organization of American States based in Washington and also in Costa Rica. And they give a forum and a tribunal to the 29 nations of Latin America where they can negotiate or mediate or have rulings against certain factions that deny internationally recognized human rights. So where are we? And I come to my bottom line now. What will you see as Americans? The United States has been reluctant to ratify certain treaties because of factions in this country. As you know, a treaty needs 2/3 ratification by the Senate. The House is not involved. We have not ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I testified on behalf of CEDWA, as it's called, on behalf of the American Bar Association, and I thought that we had the 2/3 vote, but then there's 3 or 4 old white men who denied that this to women. We still haven't ratified it. Even more heinous is that we have not ratified the Covenant on the Rights of the Child. This was almost a miracle. In 1989, very recently, the whole United Nations said we need a document to protect the rights of the child. Important people developed it. It's a fantastic document saying, here are all of the rights of the child. Every nation in the world has ratified that except the United States. And again, I testified on behalf of CRC, and one person said that, oh, this might destabilize the family. And I reminded her that the Holy See, which is very pro-family, was the 5th nation in the earth to ratify the Covenant on the Rights of the Child. Well, we look out at the world today, the world that you people will confront in the immediate future. There's 1.2 billion Muslims, 48 Islamic states. Every 5th person is a Muslim, and that we hardly know about their existence. And I confess my ignorance, even as a theologian, that I know so little about the Quran and Muslim theology. Oh, at Georgetown University, we have a new Center for Islamic Studies and a full-time imam and with courses. This is the first university to hire a full-time imam to study the Muslim religion and background. We talk about Al-Qaeda. Is that somehow directly, indirectly related to the Quran? I'm sorry to say in my ignorance that I and lots of people do not know. Why is the United States so reluctant to become international and do what we're supposed to do as a sovereign nation? The United States even withheld its dues from the United Nations for a period of time, and that crippled the UN. It impaired its functions for a long time. The United States walked out of UNESCO. We've returned now, although we haven't paid our dues yet. Why isn't the United States there as the #1 person and agency in the world? What about Latin America? I hope some of you specialize in OAS and do things. I'm not very proud at all of our record with regard to Latin America. We invaded lots of countries. We have never joined the OAS. We have never ratified the Inter-American Covenant on the Rights of People. And that the United States has dominated or sought to dominate all of Latin America. As a Catholic, this is very painful for me. That continent is overwhelmingly Catholic, and we should not be boycotting them or dominating them or invading them as we have done for so long. I can't give you a rational explanation why the United States is so isolationist, but that you should say that I want to investigate this. Let me just touch a bit on the rights of the child. This was a magnificent document, and it has had impact around the world. For example, in that document, they talk about the rights of children to the presence of a mother. And in South Africa, with their new splendid constitution, they looked at this carefully as they ratified it, and they came to the conclusion that a child needs the mother so desperately that all women in South Africa who are in jail, who have children under 12, are released. Their duty and companionship to the child is more important than any. Isn't that fantastic? And Brazil now has an ombudsman looking after the rights of the child. We need that in this country. We have hundreds. We have more children under the poverty line than any other industrialized nation. And that when we ratify, you go before a board in Geneva or New York every third year, and they criticize. We need that criticism. We need a world voice to point out that you are doing terrible things, especially to children of minority groups. Well, is anything going to happen? Let me tell you what may be the worst of all of our sins, at least lately. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, now is functioning. This is a permanent Nuremberg. It has a place in The Hague. 76 nations have joined. And the United States never joined the International Criminal Court. It was the Pentagon 5 years ago that said, no, we don't want to do that. And this administration is talking to several nations, practically begging them not to join or not to persecute Americans. This was a wonderful development proposed by the lawyers of the world. And it simply says that if any person or nation discovers an American soldier or any other person doing things that approximate the crimes against humanity, they don't arrest him or indict him. They report to the nation of origin. And if that nation of origin takes care of this within 6 months, it all goes away. So they're not going to be jumping on American soldiers and persecuting them and putting them in jail. That's the fantasy of some people at the Pentagon. If you want to write a paper, go and talk about the International Criminal Court, the ICC. This was bubbling for a long time after Nuremberg. We in the United States established Nuremberg. It phased out, and we were tired of it, and it went away. And the whole international community says that we need a world tribunal with prestige that would go after people who commit crimes against humanity. And that, in this case, for example, if Israel says, well, the president of Hamas is doing awful things, that if they or everybody were in the International Criminal Court, they could try him, give him due process, and let humanity come to some conclusion. Well, I urge you to write about the ICC and to investigate. And that as a lawyer, I was on the task force of this, so I can go on and on about why there's safeguards of all kinds in the ICC. Well, what are some of the other issues? Everybody here has wondered about the 600 people in Guantanamo. I hope the Supreme Court says that that's just wrong. My name is on a brief in connection with the Hamdi case, which the court will take up in the next several weeks, and that the legal community said this is outrageous to bring these people here, and that they have no lawyer, and that they have no contact. As you know, under severe pressure from England, the United States 3 weeks ago released 5 citizens of Great Britain that were detained at Guantanamo, and that the British government pounded on world opinion so that the Pentagon finally had to release them. 1 day later, they got a hearing in England, and England could find nothing wrong that they did, and these 5 Brits were released. They're going to sue the United States. What are the damages for 2 years of unlawful confinement in this barbaric situation? Wait and see what will happen. Will the Pentagon, when the heat gets it, well, settle for something? Who invented all of this? Well, what else are we doing? Well, we have so many things in connection with refugees, or rather with terrorism now, that no one is going to be hard on the officials if they say, well, we have to do this in the name of terrorism. However, there are limits, and if we do violate the limits, there will be consequences. I was on a presidential commission with regard to the 130,000 Japanese that we locked up during World War II. I thought that this commission was kind of futile. We did our work, important people there. We made a recommendation to Congress that all of the 60,000 surviving Japanese internees get reparations of $20,000 apiece. And they did. Incredible. The Congress said that was wrong. Even though the Supreme Court it was wrong to detain these innocent people. Well, will we have judgments like that about Guantanamo and about a lot of other people? You should say, I am interested in injustice. And you know, when you are a Christian, you have a severe obligation to say, I want justice for everybody. And that's what makes you a Christian and keeps you a Christian. And that you should say that I'm not a big liberal, I'm not a bleeding heart, but I believe in justice. When something wrong has been done, I met many of those Japanese people who had been interned for 3 years, nice men and women who were just seized out of their homes. And it hit me as never before. A society is quite capable of doing terrible things in the name of patriotism or now containing communism. Well, let me mention one other thing, a couple of other things that are terrible. We don't hear much about refugees these days. They're having a very hard time if they come from a Muslim country. There are now 18 million refugees. That means people without a home, people who have been forced out of their country of origin. That's probably the largest number since World War II, and the number is probably going to increase. At Georgetown Law School, we have a clinic for refugees, and students work there, and it quite literally transform their lives. And sometimes they are successful in getting asylum for a particular individual. Also, please be aware of religious freedom. You, more than any other university, perhaps are sensitive to the state of religious freedom around the world. It is very dreadful and getting worse in China. There are violations of the uniform or the international human rights everywhere. And that there's a new agency in the State Department now that gives particular attention to the denial of religious freedom in all countries. And their report is very illuminating. One other thing that we should be aware of is the indigenous people. I hardly knew about indigenous until I went to Vienna in 1993. There's a whole group representing the 200 million indigenous people. They were there before the colonial powers came, like the 4 million Indians in parts of Guatemala. They have not been treated well by international law. There's not even a Bill of Rights, not even a covenant on the rights of the indigenous. And they're all over Asia and in India and parts of Australia. We are very sensitive, are we not, to the ADA, the Americans with Just Democratic Action, those that are impaired physically and mentally. And I followed that in the Congress, and I was delighted when it passed. It has had a great impact. And in Vienna, I was very thrilled when a woman from Africa came up to me, and she said the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which had just passed in the United States, is the best law in the world to protect the rights of the physically and mentally handicapped. We're doing something right. But what shall we say about other issues? There's so many other. And if you're sensitive to insecurity or to injustice, you'll know these issues. And you know some of the problems probably about religious freedom in Mormons and other countries better than anybody else. There's also all types of problems with judges. The independence of the judges is taken for granted in the United States. but it is not an element of democracy in many countries. And everywhere international law is saying we have to have the independent judges and we have to have a bar association, a legal profession that is equally autonomous and independent. Well, what shall we say to close? All I know is that every moment that God gives us and we listen to people and learn things is a moment of grace. And I was in college way back, and I remember some of the lecturers that came. And one of them was Father Martin Darcy, a distinguished Jesuit. And I didn't really want to go that afternoon, but the professor said, well, we'll see you all there. So I showed up, and I won't say he transformed my life, but here is a Christian with all types of degrees from Oxford who had written books, Father Martin Darcy, and that afternoon was an elevation of what I hope to do in my life. And I hope that this little conference and your discussion can bring that about. Well, what shall I say to finish? Human rights are precious in all cultures. This is the new morality of the world. We used to talk about international law or the natural moral law, and now everybody agrees that we agree. The family of nations agrees on international human rights, and that there's monitors in Geneva everywhere. There's monitors regionally now in Africa, and that no one will challenge you if you say that violates international human rights. No one says, well, where is that? This is all down in black and white. What we lack is administration and surveillance, and that is there. And I dream that if the United States really came into this enthusiastically, God, what a difference it would make. In 1980, President Carter named Saul Linovitz as the chairman of a committee to outline a new foreign policy for the United States. They put out a beautiful report, 300 pages, and they recommended that the alleviation of hunger, especially the hunger of children, should be the #1 objective of U.S. foreign policy. The Reagan people came in and nothing was ever done. Imagine the whole world, if we had done that in 1980, and it's quite feasible to do, all of the resources should get to the elimination of hunger of children. It never happened. And today and every day, 32,000 children will die of starvation. 14 million a year. Can you imagine that? Children, 32,000, dying every day. And there's 800 million people who are inadequately nourished. All of that is preventable, and especially the thing on children. And if around the world they could say that the United States had helped us, they wouldn't hate us as they do now. They would say it's the greatest humanitarian nation in the history of the earth. My dear friends, we're only 4% of the entire universe, consuming 40% of the resources, and more now disdain, I'm afraid, than ever before in my lifetime. This is essential to Christianity, and that all I can say is that the churches in America, and especially your church, should insist more and more that we live up to our expectations. The United States is the great idealist nation. We wanted to form the League of Nations, and it was turned down by the Senate. We did form the UN and all of the 21 covenants. We were there, and we lost courage or heart or faith or something somewhere along the line. Can we rekindle all of that? We can if people like you say, I am going to take my Christianity and my patriotism and my humanism and my sense of international law and make this work for this country. Let me close with what I opened, is that people all around us and people in far foreign lands are looking to you, and we should say every person that I meet, every person that I read about, those 32,000 children who are dying, that they're Christ to me. And Christ said to us, whatsoever you do for the least of my brethren, you do for me. Thank you. No. Yeah. Some comments or some questions or some better jokes. Yes.
No jokes. Too serious. Human rights is too serious for me to joke about, I guess. But do you have any opinion or knowledge on how you think the U.S. should enforce international law?
for example, or how the world could do a better job? Seems like enforcement mechanisms are a problem. I've been working on Alien Tort Claims Act cases, and very likely the Supreme Court is going to kill that next Tuesday.
Oh, don't say that. My name is on the brief. They can't know. Oh. What's your name?
My name is Lyle Stamps. We work for a plaintiff's firm in Philadelphia, and we represent clients in the Sudan who are suffering.
Oh, okay. All right, good. You're a pro. No, I'm glad that you brought that up. And let me tell you how lawyers did this pioneering. That in the very first Congress, there was this sleeper law that no one paid much attention to for 200 years. And it simply said that an alien in this country could sue for a violation of international law. And this ingenious lawyer in New York applied this to a case of a woman who was a refugee from Paraguay, and that she sued someone who had killed her little brother, and that they recovered. And there's at least 20 or 30 cases now about the Alien Tort Statute. We updated that statute, and it's more modern. It applies also to citizens as well as aliens. And that some people in the Justice Department and some corporations don't like this, and they want the Congress to nullify it or to cut it back. I'm not certain that's going to happen. But this shows what lawyers and others can do when they say, we are going to law. And that people sued Marcos. They sued generals from Chile and from Argentina. And that even if you don't go to law school, look up the Alien Tort Statute, and particularly the case to which he made reference. I don't know how they're going to come out. It's very sticky. It involves the national sovereignty of other states. And I voted for the Foreign Service Intelligence Act when I was in Congress, and I thought it was a good act, and it may still be. But states are very jealous of their prerogatives, and the United States doesn't want to insult other nations by allowing them to be dragged into court in federal tribunals. They all want to pray instead of talk. Yeah.
You discussed a little bit about Muslims in general, but with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, do you think that, how do you feel about what Israel is doing in response to the Palestinians, and do you think the United States needs to become more involved in that situation?
I wrote a whole book about that 20 years ago. I thought I was going to solve the problem. But no, obviously this is terribly disheartening, and we're looking for some simple solution or somebody to blame. There's nobody to blame, and that there's fault on both sides. And that I think that the UN Commission on Human Rights in Geneva yesterday was right to denounce the murder, the assassination of this man. And the United States abstained, saying that, well, there was fault on both sides. But I can't see that there's ever a justification for just murdering this poor man in his wheelchair who's blind. What is the next step? Can we start the negotiations? I've been through those negotiations going back to Carter and Camp David, and he had the entire Congress on the lawn of the White House with the representatives of Egypt and Israel. We thought it was solved. And Bill Clinton did a lot of work on this. And that, as I say, there's fault on both sides. If we had the ICC, as I mentioned, there'd be a place to try this, to hear this, and to have hearings on it. But I'm afraid that our attitude and the militarism has aided and abetted these people. I'm sorry that I don't have a better solution. We're in anguish, and sometimes I get to the point that we just have to pray for both sides. And that the Jewish people are very dear to us. Christ and all the apostles were Jewish. And I saw that recent film about the Passion. You'll have individual views about it. But we should say we, as Christians, owe a great deal in reparation to the Jews, especially my church. And in 1975, in Vatican II, the Catholic Church changed its policy, and we apologized to the Jewish people. But no apology is ever adequate for what the Christian community did to those people over 20 centuries. So my heart is with them. At the same time, we have links with the entire Muslim community and with the Palestinian community. So we have to think more and care more and try to get a solution.
Yes. You were talking a little bit about sort of the judges being impartial. I was just wondering what your feelings were about Justice Scalia and whether or not he should recuse himself.
Isn't that a gorgeous little question? You know that Justice Scalia is very conservative, very impetuous, and he had to disqualify himself yesterday in the argument about under God and the pledge of allegiance because he said something stupid when it first came down in the Ninth Circuit. He said, "Oh, what a goddamn foolish!" So the plaintiff wrote to him and said, "Please recuse yourself," and he did. And so there were 8 people yesterday, but that Scalia went duck fishing, duck hunting with Mr. Cheney, and he went to Louisiana on Air Force 2. He brought his son and his son-in-law, and there were 13 others. And people, the Sierra Club said, "You can't be objective. You've been hunting with this guy. He's your buddy." And he answered it in 21 pages and said, "No, I refuse to recuse myself." And he had precedents there that are just outdated. I, in the House Judiciary Committee in 1976, updated the whole law on recusal. And we said very categorically, a federal judge shall, not may, shall, not should, shall, recuse himself if a reasonable people could think that he's not objective. Well, he said that doesn't apply. Now, if he votes in favor of Cheney to keep this thing secret, it saves Cheney a lot of embarrassment, a lot. If he votes the other way and gives the 5 to the 5-4, people say he covered up. Well, as the New York Times said very solemnly, no matter what, this is a humiliation for the Supreme Court. Now, it's not as simple as I just said, because judges have their own ideas about recusal. And we don't want judges, especially at the highest level, to recuse themselves too often, because you get a 4-4 result, which is sustained the law. A couple of years ago, the State Department asked me to seance with 12 communist generals from Beijing. It's the toughest 3 hours I've had in a long time. And they were bureaucrats. Some had their braids on. And they just said, in essence, that human rights is a construct of the West. You guys made it up. And I don't know whether we could penetrate that, but I think that China is making some inroads. They are easing just a bit in some areas of religious freedom. But no, I thought it was a welcome development, and that we would just continue the pressure. And China is under pressure this week before the UN Commission on Human Rights in Geneva. And I don't know whether we have the votes to slam them on something, but that it's endemic with them. And they were in Vienna, and these sincere people say, "Oh, Western human rights, that's the construct." And one of the generals had the chutzpah to say, "Oh, we've had those for centuries. We had them before you people knew what they were." How do you get around that? It's a different concept of society, that they don't think that way. But I think that with all the trade they're getting, certain things may change them a bit. But they may not be the most recalcitrant. I lectured in India 2 or 3 years ago, and it's a fantastic country, very mysterious. But they believe in human rights. It's in the Declaration, in their Constitution. And we just have to keep the propaganda, or keep the chatter going, keep the convictions going, and that at every level we should say this is guaranteed by international human rights. Even the U.S. Supreme Court, that has not done that much before, has referred to international covenants as a source for saying that we cannot execute a person who was a juvenile when he did the crime. Yes? She's referring to the law that I mentioned that was passed by the Congress mysteriously in 1789. And we've had our ups and downs on that, and a scholar just put out a book, all the cases involving the Alien Tort Claims Act, and that it bumps up against suing a nation, and that if somebody sued the United States in the courts of Mozambique, the United States, you have no jurisdiction, blah, blah, blah. I don't know how it's going to evolve. I'm involved in a case against Unicol. That's a big utility in California that has a huge pipeline coming out of Burma. And the allegation is that they have condoned making slaves of people from Burma, and that this violates and we want damages from Burma and from them. And they have much better lawyers than we have. We have one man, and they have 3 law firms. And I don't know who will prevail. They're in the Ninth Circuit. And frankly, it's a very sticky question. Does this infringe on the sovereignty? And the United States of America says that it does, and that we in American courts have no rights to sue or collect from Burma. As lawyers, you never take no. Yes, sir.
I've read through your book, and it seems like shame seems to be a fairly good way to get the nations to cooperate.
What is?
Shame. Like your book was Mobilization of Shame. We had a former member of the political science department here. He's currently a religious leader in our faith, Elder Porter. He kind of referred to the nation states as kind of like children, or kind of like a family. So in that sense, I've been thinking a little bit lately that your book kind of says, well, here's, we need to spank or shame the children into doing better. What about the opposite? Do you think there's any opportunity for, instead of Amnesty International, groups like that writing letters to condemn countries, what about the mobilization of praise? What about writing letters and praising leaders when they take positive steps? Like,
well, we do that all the time to the dictators in Argentina, and it doesn't hurt. I mean, thank them a little. But there's no one way. However, I'm glad you came back to the private sector. And the private sector has such power, if they only knew their power. I'm a member of the board of the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. It was established in 1990 or 89. And we just have moral power. And now we send letters to tribunals that are doing bad things to human rights activists. And once in a while, we get an amazing surprise. And we're now sending people to trials of political dissidents. And this is a nice story that some time ago they asked me if I'd go as an observer of a trial of a Lutheran pastor in South Africa. This is before the liberation. So I rearranged my little life and said, yes, I could go. And with much travail, I got a visa. And the day before I was supposed to fly, the agency calls and she says, I have good news and bad news. Okay, what's the good news? The good news is that the Lutheran theologian was liberated. Okay, what's the bad news? You can't go. Now, you never know what's going to work. It's an uncertain science. Yes?
Do you think that the U.S.'s current foreign policy towards Iraq and the activities there is helping human rights or causing more problems?
You mean around the world or there?
Specifically in Iraq as well as around the world.
No, I'm inclined to agree with Senator Rockefeller the other day that this is doing far more harm, the invasion, than we know. Everything is worse as a result of it. There's no upside. Senator Rockefeller. And I don't know whether everybody agrees on that. But no, I thought it was ill-advised, and I agree with all those ecclesiastical people that I mentioned. And no, I think we have to extricate ourselves now. And can we change public opinion? And I read the London Economist and other things, and the pattern of animosity developing, not merely in France and Germany, but across the board. So it's serious that we have to reverse this. And if our friends in faraway places think this, think of what the Muslim community, who has grievances. And so I don't know how we can pacify them just right off. There's been a long series of mistakes that's gone through the century. Yes, sir.
Is the culprit? Do we?
Well, okay. You said the United Nations, and I agree. The United Nations was discovered, was created in order to have a military weapon in cases of egregious violations of. I agree with that. However, military power always has consequences, and maybe it should be used in the extreme case. Can you ever get radical change without military? Try South Africa. Every year after the United Nations was invented, every year in many, many tribunals, we denounced apartheid. The United States had an economic boycott. The whole world boycotted economic apartheid. And that finally in the United States they said, we're going to have more economic boycotts. And the House and the Senate told Mr. Reagan that they are going to pass a bill that would require all 300 U.S. corporations to leave South Africa. And President Reagan said, I'll veto it. And he did veto it, and they passed it over his veto. Astonishing. The next day, it's all over. They said, we can't live without 300 American corporations. Mandela was freed, and the rest is history. So sometimes a long series of humiliations and less than military thing works. It doesn't always work. What will work? Well, just the change in opinion. And again, if the United States were really a leader in human rights in a wide variety of ways, if we were there enforcing the covenants, that would make a difference. Every diplomat and ambassador I've talked to said it's embarrassing to be an ambassador when we haven't ratified the basic treaties that other nations are trying to live up to. So it's bad consequences. We've never even thought about ratifying the Treaty of the Covenant on economic rights. If we did that, it would be difficult for us that would change the whole world. We want you, we will help you to get all the economic rights that are your right by international law. So those are the things that would change things. And that on military power, we haven't even reopened the question of do we need all these things. Out in the Atlantic Ocean, there's many, many submarines still carrying nuclear weapons. Billions of dollars being spent. For what? Those are the things that we have to re-examine. You are a wonderful audience, and I congratulate you and your university and your professor. And that, as the prayer said, this is a moment when God has brought us together. We don't know what He expects of us, but He expects a lot. You are the children of privilege. You have an education that virtually no one in the United States gets. And you're going on to a career in political or academic life or business life, and that much will be expected of you. And you recall what Christ said, or the gospel says, to those to whom much is given, much will be expected. I thank you for this moment of grace.